Every mystery has a voice. Few dare to listen.
It was generally agreed in the parish of St. Ethelred the Obscure that the church bells ought not to have rung at 2:30 in the morning. Bells, like respectable people, ought to keep proper hours. The fact that they had rung, slowly, unevenly, and with a most ill-tempered shudder in the final toll, was therefore received as both an outrage against tradition and a distinct affront to the nerves. The sexton, who fancied himself a man of uncommon bravery, discovered upon investigation that he was not nearly so well furnished with courage as he had once presumed. He got precisely halfway up the bell tower ladder before coming down again with abrupt haste and a complexion which suggested violent seasickness. He then announced, with a quavering baritone, that he had seen something very much out of the ordinary, and that the matter was better left to the authorities. He made a point of locking the tower door behind him, which gave the regrettable impression that the out of the ordinary was still inside. By 8 o'clock the following morning, the vicar's wife had already given her solemn opinion that the devil was involved, and the constable, perspiring gently through his uniform, was attempting, with poor success, to dissuade her from repeating this suggestion to parishioners. Rural scandal spreads most efficiently when skimming in pious disguise. It was at this delicately unstable moment that Lord Peter Wimsey arrived. He had not, as gossip swiftly suggested, been summoned by Scotland Yard in some furtive capacity. He had, in fact, been motoring northward in leisurely retreat from town and had stopped to admire the church's Norman arch, while his valet, Bunter, inspected the local inn's prospects for luncheon. Wimsey had but one foot upon the gravel path when he became aware that he had intruded upon drama. There is no magnet in nature so strong as a mystery, provided it is none of one's own business. "Oh dear," he said lightly, removing his monocle and polishing it upon an immaculate handkerchief. "The parish appears to be in a condition of theological excitement. One trusts no one has tried to improve the sermon by dying in an interesting fashion." The constable, who lacked both a sense of humor and the nerve to walk away, muttered something about an unfortunate discovery, and best not speculated upon publicly. The vicar's wife, delighted to have an audience, leaned forward with the air of one disseminating revelation. "The tower is haunted, Lord, Wellington." "Wimsey," he corrected gently. "A distinct improvement on the Duke, I assure you. The Duke, poor fellow, had dreadful luck with the modern press." "The sexton saw a shape," she continued with relish, "a dreadful shape among the bells." "How uncooperative of it not to be geometrically specific," murmured Wimsey. "If it had been triangular or octagonal, we might have drawn theological conclusions." The constable reddened. "Look here, my lord, there's no call to make light." "On the contrary," said Wimsey, "mysteries become infinitely worse when left in the dark. One must either illuminate them or blow them to smithereens. I favor illumination. Much tidier." He glanced toward the tower door, the heavy key still trembling in the sexton's damp grasp. "May I?" The constable hesitated. The proper instinct of all men who sense they are being outpaced, but propriety, awe, and a suspicion of privilege conspired in Wimsey's favor. The key was surrendered. Wimsey tested its weight between finger and thumb, a curiously solemn little gesture, then turned the lock. The smell met them first, cold stone, stale rope dust, and the unmistakable coppery sweetness that attends violent death. "Ah," said Wimsey softly, with that faint, unreadable detachment of his. "So someone has tried to improve the sermon." He ascended. And at the top, against the clammy morning light filtering through the louvres, hung the body. The bell rope was wound with meticulous care about the throat. The head drooped at a sickening angle. The face, waxen and strangely peaceful, turned a little toward the door as though listening for latecomers. Lord Peter observed a moment in complete silence. "A trifle early," he murmured at length, "for matins, but a very final way of calling the congregation." The body was that of the church organist, Mr. Hugh Doncaster, a man of mild expression, self-important moustache, and, according to the vicar's earlier and rather faintly expressed opinion, a positively Calvinistic sense of musical propriety. His shoes hung 2 inches clear of the planks. One had slipped halfway off, as though even death could not persuade him to depart from comfort without protest. A hymn book, curiously out of place at such a height, lay face down upon the narrow landing, its gilt-edged pages crushed and buckled. Whimsy examined the arrangement of the rope first, not the body. This, too, was characteristic of him. He frowned slightly at the knot, his head tilting with something like disappointment. Then, tucking 2 fingers behind his lapel, he turned and descended again, the echo of his steps tapping out a slow and thoughtful rhythm. At the foot of the stair, the vicar had materialized in a state of pious agitation, clutching his cassock like a drowning man clings to salvageable scripture. "A most appalling tragedy," he stammered, "and in the bell tower of all places. Such a desecration, such an affront." "Quite," said Whimsy pleasantly. "Dead, I'm afraid, and not of religious enthusiasm." The constable, already sweating afresh, blurted, "Suicide, would you say, my lord?" as if willing the answer into existence so that something, at least, might be signed and filed away. "Oh, indubitably," Whimsy drawled, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. "One always climbs 40-odd feet of badly lit vertical ladder to do away with oneself. So considerate to spare the household carpets? What?" The constable blushed a shade deeper. The vicar coughed into his collar. Whimsy's gaze drifted, not idly but with feline care, over the small knot of villagers gathering like damp laundry along the lich gate. Servants stood mixed among them. The housekeeper from the rectory, the verger's boy, the maid with the pinched mouth, who looked simultaneously frightened and furious, as though the corpse were an inconvenience delivered to her schedule by poor taste. Bunter reappeared across the churchyard, with military quietness, having evidently completed his survey of the inn. He halted precisely 3 paces behind Whimsy and waited. He did not look at the bell tower, yet somehow contrived to acknowledge it. "Bunter," Lord Peter said, without glancing round, "I believe we shall be staying a little longer than luncheon." "Very good, my lord." The vicar drew himself up. "If you intend," informally of course, "to look into the matter, oh heavens, no," said Whimsy lightly. "I merely dislike unsolved noises in the night, bells included." His eyes, keen and careless at once, drifted toward the crowd. "Besides, my dear sir, I have so often found that a corpse in a parish is like a stone dropped in a duck pond. The ripples are extremely educational." That earned him a brittle silence, a village's collective instinct shrinking tight about its little secrets. He turned to the sexton. "Did you lock the tower after hearing the bells, or before you went up?" The man dropped his gaze, fumbling with the cap crushed in his hands. "After I come down again, my lord. I didn't know what he was at first." "Ah, and the bells rang before you entered?" "Aye." "Entirely by themselves, how obliging of them." The words were silk, the meaning flint. There was a stir among the watchers, a faint unease. Whimsy caught it, stored it somewhere behind his casual manner, and proceeded as though he had seen nothing at all. "Very good," he said at last. "I should be obliged if no one sets foot in the tower for the time being. Let the poor fellow have his privacy. The living have been intruding quite enough." He smiled blandly, but his gaze had already slid once again to the maid with the pinched mouth. She looked away, far too quickly. Whimsy followed the shift like a dog scenting wind. "And now," he said, settling his hat with a cheerfulness that fooled no one, "I think a word with those who knew our late bell-ringer best might prove most illuminating. Murder has such a tiresome way of beginning in the most domestic corners." They shepherded the witnesses into the vestry, which smelled faintly of wax, hymnals, and unshed confessions. The vicar fluttered at Whimsy's elbow like a clerical moth, uncertain whether to officiate or apologize. The maid, the pinched one, stood stiffly by the far wall, hands knotted in her apron. Her name, supplied in a whisper, was Alice Harrow. Whimsy chose a chair as though choosing a vantage in a theatre. He crossed one leg over the other and regarded the company with easy courtesy, which was precisely the sort of thing that put nervous people most off their guard. "Perhaps," he said, "we should begin with the dull but dutiful preliminaries. Mr. Doncaster was last seen alive when?" The vicar answered first, too hastily. "At the Thursday choir practice." No, that was yesterday. Well, last evening, certainly. He left the rectory at about 9:30. It was an oddly uncertain statement concerning a man who had been found hanged like a grotesque offertory less than 12 hours later. Did anyone see him thereafter? Whimsy's tone was pleasant as a summer breeze. The housekeeper from the rectory, a broad and capable woman of unshakable shoe-leather morality, answered, "Only Alice, sir. She brought up his supper tray, because he said he had some composition work to finish and wouldn't be down again." Alice flinched, almost imperceptibly. "And was he in good spirits?" Whimsy asked, a faint twitch of the mouth. "He was, as usual, sir," which was a marvelously neutral thing to say about a man now suspended by his neck. Whimsy leaned forward a touch. "You were the last to bring him food? No one else went up? No visitors?" The girl hesitated. Not long, but long enough. Something unpracticed in her poise. "No, sir," she said. "Only me." There was a tiny emphasis on only which did not escape him. "And how long did you remain?" "Just long enough to set the tray down. He didn't like people lingering." "I'm sure," murmured Whimsy, as if receiving a tidbit of great nourishment. The constable shifted, emboldened by this turn toward the comfortable territory of cause and circumstance. "There's been talk in the village, my lord, about him being, well, strict with the choir. A stickler, if you take my meaning." "Strict choir masters rarely inspire murder," Whimsy said. "They merely inspire late arrivals." "Begging your pardon," the housekeeper interrupted. "But Mr. Doncaster had his ways, sir. He liked things just so, never content unless it were perfect. If people didn't suit, he said so plain." A pause. "Sometimes sharper than that." Whimsy made a soft humming noise. Not agreement, precisely, but registration. "So much devotion to accuracy," he said gently. "One hesitates to hang such a man for carelessness." The vicar coughed. "The sexton insists the tower was locked last night. We all know it was. I keep the duplicate key myself, and it has not been touched." "Yes," Whimsy replied, as though the vicar had just recited a weather report. "A locked tower, a body inside, and very little in the way of celestial assistance." His eyes returned to Alice. "Tell me, my dear, did you notice anything unusual when you went up with the tray?" She swallowed. "No, sir. Nothing? Not even a sound? It is an odd business, bells tolling in solitude. They're gregarious creatures by nature." Her gaze flicked downward. There weren't any bells ringing then. "No? How refreshing. So the bells waited politely until after he was dead." The girl looked faintly ill. The housekeeper shot her a warning glance, a glance with far more content than the words thus far allowed. Whimsy's smile thinned. It was not unkind, but it was surgical. "Very well. I shall not press you, yet. But memory is a curious creature. It grows obliging after a little coaxing." He rose, brushing an invisible fleck of dust from his cuff. "Perhaps I should like a look at Mr. Doncaster's rooms presently, purely out of charitableness, to see whether the dead man left anything resembling a note, farewell, apology, confession, or literary experiment." He paused at the vestry door. After all, if it was suicide, he ought to have told us so. The living hate loose ends. Alice Harrow lifted her head then, only a fraction, but with the pale, wretched tightness of someone who knew a loose end and feared its unraveling. Whimsy saw it. He said nothing. He didn't need to. For guilt, when genuine, is seldom loud. It leaks through silence like water through stone. The late organist's lodging comprised 2 narrow rooms above the vestry, an arrangement dignified by tradition but rendered faintly ridiculous by plumbing. The stair was steep and meanly lit, and as Whimsy ascended he ran one gloved finger lightly along the banister, as though amused to test what residue of habit and secrecy it might leave upon him. The little sitting-room was neat to the point of spite. Sheet music lay in rigidly aligned stacks, not one page out of true. A metronome rested on the escritoire, its brass pendulum stilled at an angle, frozen mid-swing like a beheaded executioner caught in reflection. Not suicide, then, at least not the untidy sort. A tray, barely touched, waited upon a side table. A heel of bread, 3/4 of a cup of cooled tea, and the faint smear of something pale beside the saucer, as if a hand had trembled or recoiled. Whimsy bent, sniffed delicately, then spoke without looking behind him. "Bunter." "Yes, my lord." "You observe the cup?" "I do, my lord." "Fingerprints?" "Several, one set heavier than the rest, consistent with a nervous grip." "And the smear?" "Could be spilt milk at first glance, my lord. But there is an odor, linseed oil, faintly, possibly varnish." "Organ repairs," Whimsy suggested mildly. "Possibly, though I rather thought organists had people to do such things for them." "Just so." Whimsy straightened, turning his gaze to the writing desk. Papers lay beneath a blotter in unbroken order. A pen sat capped, its nib dry. No farewell letter. No torn page. Certainly no attempt to unburden the soul. One might almost say Mr. Doncaster had left his affairs not merely unfinished, but interrupted. He passed into the inner room. This, too, was almost ascetic. Bed made with schoolmaster's briskness, wardrobe fastidiously closed, an umbrella stand containing only a single ebony walking stick polished to a vanity sheen. Whimsy paused, considering that oddly theatrical detail, a fastidious clergyman's rod in a music master's lodgings. At the foot of the bed sat a pair of soft house slippers, precisely aligned, not worn since yesterday. He returned to the sitting room without comment. The constable hovered in the doorway, clearly hoping to receive official reassurance that nothing interesting was amiss. "Nothing overturned," Whimsy observed cheerfully. "No sign of upset, no hurried struggle. A flawless portrait of self-possession. Except—" His gaze drifted to the doorframe, the merest scuffing upon the paint near the latch. "Except," he continued, "one does not ordinarily bruise the jamb going out." The constable looked hopelessly lost. "Meaning, my lord?" "Meaning," said Whimsy, lounging idly against the mantel as though discussing the weather, "that someone entered in haste and left in greater haste, or else our Mr. Doncaster suffered a sudden attack of gymnastics before prayer." He allowed this to sink in. "And if he was visited," he added softly, "one must ask whether they parted on cordial terms." The housekeeper, still stationed dutifully at the stairhead, shifted uneasily. Whimsy watched her from the corner of his eye. "I assume," he said, smoothing his cuff, "that Mr. Doncaster was not in the habit of entertaining lady callers late at night?" "Certainly not," the woman declared, far too swiftly. "Splendid," murmured Whimsy. "Then we are left with gentlemen callers, or burglars with a keen interest in choral harmony. Neither, I confess, seems wholly satisfactory." He turned to Bunter. "The girl, Alice Harrow. Watch her a moment, if you please. Not abruptly. Shadows speak best when not startled." "Very good, my lord." The constable cleared his throat. "Then you think someone else was here?" Whimsy smiled. A bright, polished thing with no warmth at all. "My dear fellow, I do not think yet. I merely refrain from believing convenient miracles. Bells don't toll themselves at 2:30 to commemorate a man who was already dead. Unless, of course, The dead were considerate enough to schedule their demise with ecclesiastical flourish. He closed the door behind them with care. And that, he added lightly as they descended, is the difficulty with murder. The murderer is hardly ever as tidy as the corpse. Back in the vestry, Whimsy requested the vicar to produce a small notebook belonging to Mr. Doncaster, one that had been hastily stuffed into a drawer for safekeeping after the initial discovery. The pages, covered in minute, almost microscopic notation, detailed the weekly choir arrangements, repair dates for the organ, and a curious sequence of initials beside each entry, A.H., J.B., and so forth. Whimsy's brow lifted imperceptibly. He leaned over the desk, letting the sunlight strike the letters, illuminating tiny smudges of ink where the writer's hand had lingered a moment too long. "Interesting," he murmured. "A rhythm in the chaos. Patterns that mean something yet are camouflaged in plain sight." His eyes flicked once more toward Alice Harrow, standing stiffly, her apron grasped so tightly it might have been a vice. "And you, my dear," he said, sliding the book across the table. "Were you aware that your initials appear beside several of Mr. Doncaster's notes?" Alice flushed violently, lips pressed in a straight line. I was asked to arrange the music for the Thursday rehearsal, sir. He told me to make annotations if anything was amiss." "That's all?" "Of course," said Whimsy, in a tone that suggested complete acceptance while storing her every word in a meticulously ordered mental file. A responsible girl, conscientious and involved to a degree. Naturally. The housekeeper shuffled near the doorway. "It was perfectly ordinary work, my lord. Nothing that could have—" "Yes, yes," Whimsy said, giving her a small conciliatory wave. "Ordinary, and yet we find ourselves in extraordinary circumstances. Human nature does tend to complicate neat arrangements." The constable coughed. "You don't think, my lord, that she—" "I think," Whimsy interrupted gently, "that speculation has its uses, but clarity has more. One must first assemble facts, dear constable, before leaping to conclusions that might embroil the innocent." He rose and strolled to the window, hands clasped behind his back. From this vantage point, the bell tower seemed less a site of crime than an instrument awaiting its master. Its wooden frame shivering in the morning breeze, the rope swaying slightly as though still vibrating with the echoes of a nocturnal lament. "Observe the clock," Whimsy said abruptly, pointing to the tower's face. 2:30 in the morning, you say. Bells tolling unevenly, a solitary figure discovered thereafter. The sexton locks the tower, citing his own timidity. And yet, by the time we arrived, the door was locked, the body arranged in, shall we say, an artful pose. The vicar swallowed audibly. "You mean it was arranged?" "In a sense, yes," Whimsy said softly. The dead man did not stumble or lunge upon the rope. Someone ensured his departure from the world appeared orderly, punctilious even. It is theatrical, not common, not casual. Alice Harrow bit her lip, and the housekeeper's eyes narrowed. Whimsy noticed the subtle exchange, the rapid flash of recognition passing like a shadow over otherwise sober faces. "And the windows?" he added, scanning the narrow vestry panes. "Were any ajar? Locked from the inside, of course, yet our friend in the tower clearly had an exit. Did anyone hear a sound? Any disturbance apart from the bells?" "Nothing, sir," the housekeeper said with slight stiffness. "We heard nothing. The village was asleep." "Precisely," Whimsy murmured, tapping a finger on the desk. "Silence is a curious companion to murder. It does not lie, though it does mislead." He stepped back, letting the weight of his observation settle over the small gathering. "Now, one more question, if I may. The sexton, when he ventured into the tower before discovering the body, saw something, did he not?" The vicar's mouth opened. He hesitated, perhaps deciding between truth and prudence. He claims he saw a figure, indistinct, at the very top among the ropes. Whimsy's eyes gleamed faintly. And yet, when he reached it, there was nothing to be found save our unfortunate organist. Curiously inconsistent, wouldn't you say? A matter for further scrutiny. Our nocturnal visitor seems to have left no trace save that which was arranged for effect. He paused, surveying the small room, the gathered witnesses, the sunlight striking the shelves. So we are left with two threads, a body meticulously posed and a witness seeing what should not have existed, and both threads converge upon one question. Who, with intent and knowledge, could orchestrate such a display? One requires a careful chronology before proceeding. Nothing must be overlooked. Even as he spoke, Whimsy's gaze flickered again toward Alice Harrow. The girl's hands twitched imperceptibly. The tension in her shoulders betrayed a secret worry. But Whimsy said nothing. He merely filed the small signs away, cataloguing them for the moment when their meaning would emerge with inescapable clarity. Whimsy left the vestry with Bunter following silently behind, the two of them crossing the dew-silvered churchyard toward the vicarage. The village, still largely asleep, offered only the occasional crowing of a distant cock or the faint rustle of a startled cat. It was the perfect hour for secrets to fester unnoticed, and Whimsy's eyes, half-lidded and entirely calculating, noted each shuttered window, each quiet figure slipping by with a purpose as yet undefined. Inside the vicarage, the household had assembled under the pretext of breakfast, though the mood was strained and brittle. The vicar hovered nervously, cutting small slices of toast with mechanical precision, while the housekeeper hovered behind him like a darkly polished sentinel. Alice Harrow stood near the sideboard, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened, her posture rigid. Whimsy seated himself with deliberate ease, surveying the company as if appraising a small tableau. "Breakfast," he said, "always proves educational, though seldom nourishing to the conscience. We are presented with character in its rawest form, particularly when one's appetite is tempered by circumstance." Alice's lips twitched, a fleeting, almost invisible movement, and Whimsy's gaze fell upon her with the faintest lift of interest. "Miss Harrow," he said lightly, "you prepared the evening repast for Mr. Doncaster yesterday, did you not?" "Yes, my lord," she replied softly. "And nothing unusual occurred during your visit? No disturbances, no calls, no visitors?" She shook her head. Whimsy watched the faint trembling of her fingers and the rapid blink of her eyes. He made no comment. Instead, he turned toward the vicar. "You mentioned the sexton, of course. His testimony is curious. He claimed to have seen a figure at the tower. Did anyone else notice anything amiss last night?" "Not that I am aware, my lord," said the vicar, carefully avoiding Alice's glance. "The village sleeps, you understand. Few are awake at that hour." "Precisely," Whimsy murmured. "Yet here we have a locked tower, a corpse, and a witness. And the clocks, my dear vicar, were they observed to be correct last night?" The vicar frowned. "They are usually accurate, yes. Why?" "Only a trivial point," said Whimsy airily. "But trivial points often lead to enlightenment. One cannot dismiss the measure of time when reconstructing nocturnal events." He leaned back, steepling his fingers, eyes sweeping the room. "Now, consider the organist's meticulous nature. He preferred order, exactitude, routine. Someone wishing to stage his departure from this world would have had to be familiar not only with his habits, but with the timing of his movements. That is the first layer. The second, one must account for observation. A figure perceived and yet unseen is a contradiction that requires resolution." The housekeeper shifted uneasily, muttering under her breath, and Whimsy caught the word "maid." He made no outward sign, but stored the remark carefully. "Observation," he repeated, as though talking to himself. "Who watches and who is watched? One must always consider both sides." Bunter, standing discreetly near the window, pointed silently toward a small envelope left upon the breakfast table. Whimsy picked it up with gloved fingers, noting the absence of a seal or signature. Inside was a note in Mr. Doncaster's handwriting, containing nothing more than a single line. Rehearsal, 9 p.m. Thursday. Do not be late. No indication of fear, threat, or foreknowledge of demise. The line was neat, ordinary, utterly banal, yet its presence was significant, for it confirmed a precise chronology. Whimsy tapped it with a finger. Ordinary notes for extraordinary consequences. How charmingly inconvenient. He replaced the paper and rose. It is clear we must reconstruct the hours immediately preceding our unfortunate musician's death. One cannot rely on assumption, one must rely on verifiable sequences. He glanced at Alice Harrow, who shrank slightly under the weight of his gaze, and then at the vicar, who nodded stiffly, his face pale beneath the morning light. And so, dear friends, Whimsy continued, we shall begin the slow, meticulous testing of chronology. Distances must be measured, times compared, doors examined for marks. All apparent trivialities, yet they will reveal what casual observation cannot. We proceed cautiously, for the devil, as it happens, hides in detail. With that, he swept from the room, Bunter in his wake, leaving the household to whisper speculations among themselves. Whimsy's mind, already working on multiple layers, the locked tower, the semi-witnessed figure, the precise timing of the organist's last movements, began assembling a pattern, subtle and insistent, that would guide him closer to the truth hidden within the morning's fragile light. Whimsy and Bunter left the vicarage and began a methodical inspection of the church and its immediate surroundings, moving with the quiet deliberation of men accustomed to measuring not only space but the implications of each footstep. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint tang of damp stone and the distant brine of the sea. Every sound seemed amplified against the stillness of the village streets. First, the tower itself. Whimsy ran a hand along the rope of the heaviest bell, noting its slight fray where it looped around the pulley, a small detail invisible from the ground. He gestured for Bunter to examine the ladder closely. "Observe," he murmured, "the wear of the treads. A ladder used nightly leaves distinct impressions. A ladder scarcely touched reveals itself even more clearly." Bunter knelt, squinting at the darkened wood. "Odd," he said. "Only the lower rungs show frequent use. Above that, comparatively clean." "Meaning," Whimsy said, his tone light yet edged with satisfaction, "that the upper portion was climbed infrequently or by someone exceedingly careful. Not our organist, who is accustomed to ascending and descending this structure daily and with enthusiasm sufficient to polish the upper rungs to a dull gleam." He moved to the doorframe and ran a fingertip over the scuff marks he had noted before. "Here, Bunter. Notice the directionality. Someone exited the tower in a hurry, yes, but carefully enough to leave the rope untouched at the bell. A neat deception, don't you think? One orchestrates theatrics not only for effect, but for observation." Bunter inclined his head. "Someone who wished to be perceived, but not truly seen." "Precisely, the interplay of visibility and concealment, an art the ordinary burglar does not practice." Whimsy tapped the door. "Now, the windows." He examined each, testing latches and examining the sill for dust or footprints. "Closed, locked, untouched," he murmured. So the figure witnessed by the sexton was either fleeting or projected. A trick of shadow, reflection, or a misapprehension. "Could he have been mistaken, my lord?" Bunter asked. "Entirely possible," said Whimsy. "But the question remains, who stood there, if anyone? Who might have had motive and opportunity to engage in such theatrics? That is where human psychology enters the stage, my dear Bunter." They moved to the gravelled path below, noting the impressions left by footsteps in the night. Whimsy crouched and examined the earth closely. "Interesting," he said. "One set leads from the vicarage to the tower. Another returns in a slightly altered trajectory. Someone was mindful of observation, but not entirely cautious. There is a discrepancy here. The returning footprint does not match in size precisely the departing one. Could be the sexton, Bunter suggested. No, too heavy a step. Our sexton, as we know, trembles at shadows and whispers, and his footprint would be correspondingly modest. No, we are dealing with someone accustomed to stealth and precision. They continued around the churchyard, Whimsy noting the orientation of gates, fences, and hedges. Every boundary is a constraint, every hedge a potential concealment. But there is a rhythm here, he said, tapping the gravel with a shoe. Patterns exist, Bunter, even in seemingly trivial movement. We shall trace them, and the chronology will emerge. They paused near a narrow side gate, overgrown and half-hidden. Whimsy crouched and examined the latch. "See here," he said. "The gate swings freely, yet the vegetation is untrampled, save for this narrow corridor. Someone has passed this way recently with deliberate choice of path. Not casual wandering, a path chosen with the purpose of being observed or avoided." Bunter made a note of it. Whimsy straightened, brushing gravel from his sleeve. "We must now correlate these observations with time, with witnesses, and with what each person knew. Opportunity, motive, and execution converge to form a pattern. And once the pattern is clear, the orchestrator, our maestro of midnight theatrics, will emerge, not by force, but by inevitability." His eyes swept once more over the sleeping village, the church towers, the quiet cottages, and the distant wind-swept fields. "Every detail is a note," he said softly, almost to himself, and together they form a composition. If we play it correctly, it will sing the truth in a voice no one can deny. He allowed a faint smile, one that hinted both amusement and calculation. "We are, I think, on the brink of understanding something quite extraordinary, disguised as the most ordinary of tragedies." By midday, the village had become a living map of whispered conjectures and careful observation. Whimsy returned to the vicarage, accompanied by Bunter, with the express purpose of clarifying the timeline. He seated himself once more at the breakfast table, spreading out a small pad and pencil with an air of casual authority, as if preparing merely to sketch a summer landscape. The constable hovered, uncertain whether to intervene or defer entirely, and the vicar, already pale from the morning's anxieties, peered over his spectacles. "Let us reconstruct the last hours," Whimsy said, fingers steepled. The Thursday rehearsal, the departure from the vicarage, the bell's nocturnal disturbance, and the subsequent discovery. Every event is a link, however trivial it may appear. We begin with Mr. Doncaster's last known movements. Alice Harrow shifted slightly, hands clasped so tightly it was a wonder she could maintain her composure. "I brought him supper," she said quietly. He thanked me and said he wished to practice some new arrangements. That was about 9:15. "And thereafter?" Whimsy's tone was bland, measured, entirely innocuous. I did not see him again," she admitted. "And the vicar, you had visitors that evening?" Whimsy asked. "Only the usual parishioners, my lord," the vicar replied. "No one out of the ordinary?" "Excellent. Now the sexton claims to have observed something at the tower around 2:30. Let us assume he is not fabricating. In that case, someone was in the tower between 9:15 and 2:30. Someone besides the organist, and someone capable of performing with meticulous precision. Who else had access?" The vicar hesitated. "Well, the keys are kept in the vestry. Only myself, the sexton, and occasionally the maid." Alice drew in a quick breath, but said nothing. Whimsy's eyes flicked toward her imperceptibly, noting the slightest shift in posture. "Indeed," he murmured, "so access is tightly controlled. And yet the body is found in a pose that suggests premeditation, the rope handled with care, the bells rung. Someone orchestrated the evening with deliberate intention. Quite clever, really, in a dark sort of way." Bunter scribbled notes in his precise hand, while Whimsy's gaze swept across the room, lingering on the small details others would overlook. The slight smudge of dust on the windowsill, the misplaced hymn book on the table, the tiny trace of wax on the corner of a chair. Each was insignificant alone, but together they formed a lattice of circumstance. Now, Whimsy continued, consider the discrepancy in footprints. One set leads toward the tower, another returns, slightly altered in size and gait. We know the sexton was too timid for stealth, the organist, immaterial, since he was at his final rest. That leaves a third party, someone intimate with the house, familiar with the clock of events, confident enough to mislead casual observation. Alice's face paled. The housekeeper's hands flexed involuntarily. Whimsy's voice remained calm, almost lyrical. Opportunity exists where access is natural, and opportunity is compounded when one's movements are expected rather than scrutinized. This is elementary psychology. Humans, when confident, become careless, even the most attentive. He leaned back, tapping his pencil against the pad. We have motive to consider, naturally. But first, chronology. We must map every movement between supper and discovery. Let us list them with observations and verify each by witness or circumstance. He paused, eyes narrowing, and allowed the tension to settle. The pattern is emerging. It is subtle, almost invisible, but it is there. So subtle that only the meticulous mind will perceive it. And yet, when observed, the orchestration reveals itself with perfect inevitability. The constable, brow furrowed, ventured, "You really think someone staged it so deliberately, my lord?" Whimsy smiled faintly. "I do not think, my dear fellow, I observe. When the clock, the bell rope, the footprints, the timing of meals, and the witnesses' recollections align, one is compelled to conclude not randomness, but deliberate action." He looked toward Alice again, whose hands were trembling now, though she did her best to keep her head raised. "Ah," he said softly, almost to himself, "how the innocent, or those who believe themselves so, may conceal far more than they imagine. Timing, access, meticulous arrangement, all point to a mind not merely opportunistic, but attentive to detail and patient to an extraordinary degree." Bunter's pencil scratched steadily. Whimsy's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, drifted to the window across the quiet village. The theater of this little tragedy is small, intimate, and yet suffused with signals. All that remains is to watch, to listen, and to wait for a slip. Human nature rarely withstands the strain of self-deception indefinitely. And with that, he rose, smooth as a cat, smoothing his jacket, and with Bunter silently in attendance, began to arrange the day's next movements, interviews, observations, small tests of timing and memory, all the quiet measures by which a master detective teases certainty from the chaos of human error. The threads were in place, the pattern hinted at, and only the minutiae, yet unobserved, would complete the tableau of guilt and cunning. By mid-afternoon, Whimsy had conducted a careful tour of the village streets, testing the limits of sound, light, and line of sight as if rehearsing the night itself. Each gate, hedge, and cobbled path received meticulous attention. He measured distances with a gloved hand against the air, noted the angles at which shadows fell, and tapped on walls to detect hollow echoes. Bunter followed quietly, recording the minutiae that would later form the skeleton of the night's movements. Returning to the vicarage, Whimsy summoned the housekeeper to the small parlor. "A matter of civility," he said lightly, "and observation. We need to verify certain domestic routines, who goes where and when, so that we may understand what was seen or what was assumed to have been seen." The woman's composure was firm but brittle. She understood instinctively that the investigation was now circling close to truths she might prefer left undiscovered. "You keep the keys to the vicarage?" Whimsy asked. "Only you, the vicar, and occasionally Alice. Is that correct?" "Yes, my lord, that is correct," she replied, voice steady. "Excellent. Then we can eliminate accidental intrusion by strangers. The tower is secure, the doors, the windows, all locked. And yet we have a visitor, or at least a presence, according to the sexton, and a body arranged with precision, who therefore has both knowledge and access, who can time each movement with confidence and arrange the scene so that the unwary witness perceives something startling, yet inaccurate." The housekeeper's eyes narrowed slightly, though she offered no answer. Whimsy inclined his head, making no effort to press her. He had observed the faintest flicker in her expression. That was sufficient for now. Next, he requested to speak with Alice alone. In the small parlour, the girl fidgeted, her hands twisting the edge of her apron. Whimsy seated himself, relaxed, though his eyes were sharp and unrelenting. "Miss Harrow, do you recall the exact time you brought supper to Mr. Doncaster last night?" "About 9:15, my lord," she replied. I did not stay long." "And no one visited the tower after that? No voices? No footsteps?" Alice shook her head, lips pressed tightly together. "No, sir." Whimsy tapped his pencil on the table, rhythmically. "And the sexton claims to have seen someone at 2:30. You understand the discrepancy, I presume? One can either dismiss it as a figment of imagination, or one can consider that the witness saw what he was led to see." Alice's eyes widened imperceptibly. Led to see," she whispered. Whimsy leaned forward, expression gentle, deceptively so. "People are surprisingly suggestible in dim light, my dear. Shadows stretch, objects shift, and the mind, eager to impose meaning, will supply what is expected. But one must ask, who benefits from such an illusion? Who possesses both the subtlety to stage it and the familiarity to ensure it works?" She swallowed hard. Whimsy let the silence settle, a slow weight pressing upon her. Then he rose, smoothing his jacket, and walked toward the window, gazing out at the church tower. Every act, every step, every misdirection leaves a mark. One must only know where and how to look, and one must wait, for the pattern is patient, and so too must be the observer. Bunter, standing quietly behind him, nodded minutely as if noting the implicit instructions. Outside, the shadows lengthened, curling along the gravestones and hedges. Whimsy's gaze returned to the tower. The orchestration of this little drama is subtle, meticulous. Human error will emerge, as it always does, and when it does, the invisible threads become visible, and the architect of the evening can no longer hide behind the veil of routine. He turned back, toward Alice with a faint smile, seemingly benign, yet full of latent scrutiny. "Now, my dear, you may find it prudent to reflect upon each detail of last night's events. However trivial it may seem, even the smallest slip will illuminate the path for those with the patience to observe." Alice remained silent, lips pressed thin, eyes downcast. Whimsy's attention shifted seamlessly to the housekeeper, who watched them with a rigid posture. "Timing, access, observation, and familiarity," he murmured almost to himself as he collected his notes. "We have the tools to reconstruct the evening's subtle choreography, and once reconstructed, the truth will emerge, not through confession, but through inevitability." He stepped toward the door, glancing once more at the church tower, already imagining the sequence of movements, the placement of shadows, the precise alignment of opportunity and human intention. Every element of the night was accounted for in his mind, yet still awaited the final alignment that would reveal the invisible hand guiding the tragedy. As evening approached, the village settled into a stillness almost conspiratorial, the fading light curling along the roof lines and hedges as though nature itself were observing the investigation. Whimsy and Bunter returned to the church, intent upon a more detailed reconstruction of the tower and its surroundings. The afternoon's observations had formed a skeleton. Now he sought to breathe life into the chronology, to trace each step, each hesitation, each human choice that had led to the grisly tableau above. Whimsy ascended the tower ladder, noting once more the wear of the rungs and the frayed rope, measuring distances with gloved hands and attentive eyes. "Observe, Bunter," he said, gesturing toward the pulleys and ropes. "The slight difference in friction between the bells. An unpracticed hand would produce a different resonance, one inconsistent with that which the sexton reported hearing." He touched the rope lightly, demonstrating a motion both precise and fluid. Only someone familiar with the mechanics and confident in their timing could have produced such an effect. Bunter made careful notes, his pencil scratching steadily. "The upper rungs are barely marked, my lord. Whoever ascended in the night moved deliberately, not recklessly." "Indeed. And the organist," Whimsy continued, "was meticulous. He would not have left such a signature, even inadvertently. No, this is a carefully constructed scene, designed to mislead, to suggest, yet not reveal." He examined the small landing where the body had been found, noting the angle of the rope, the placement of the shoes, the tilted hymn book. "A theatrical composition," he murmured, "composed in darkness, yet executed with precision." Descending, he led Bunter to the adjacent vestry. He motioned toward the window sills and door frames, observing dust, faint scuffs, and the subtle asymmetry of displaced objects. "These," he said softly, "are the whispers of movement. They speak not in words, but in evidence. One must listen carefully." He then addressed the constable, who had rejoined them. "We require absolute clarity concerning last night's visitors. Each step, each presence, every sound, documented with care." The constable nodded, clearly overwhelmed by the attention to nuance, but dutiful. Whimsy's gaze swept to Alice Harrow and the housekeeper, who had followed at a respectful distance. "I would ask you both, if you please, to recount your movements and observations once more. Trivialities, minute details, the manner in which one handled objects or hesitated. These are the elements upon which deduction rests." Alice shifted, the tension in her frame palpable. She recounted the same sequence as before, though this time Whimsy's questions, deliberately pedantic, almost mischievous, elicited new subtleties. The precise manner she had placed the tray, the order in which utensils had been arranged, the fleeting hesitation before she left the tower door. Each detail, seemingly innocuous, formed a lattice-work of human behavior. The housekeeper corroborated, adding minor points of timing and movement that seemed insignificant, yet, under Whimsy's scrutiny, accumulated like tiny beads forming a chain. Whimsy reclined against the vestry wall, rubbing his chin lightly. Access, opportunity, timing, and observation, all accounted for. And yet, one last consideration: motive. While opportunity is a scaffold, the human heart provides the architect's hand. He paused, eyes narrowing as if measuring the weight of intention itself. We know who could access the tower, who could manipulate the scene, and who was familiar enough with the routines to avoid detection. What remains is the emotional calculus. Who stood to gain or to orchestrate such meticulous theater? Bunter looked up, pencil poised. "It seems, my lord, that the pattern points most naturally towards someone inside the household." "Precisely, Bunter. Yet natural is not always synonymous with complete. One must account for subtle deflections, misperceptions, and the veneer of propriety. The person who conceived this scenario is clever, patient, and familiar with both the victim's habits and the expectations of casual observers." Whimsy's eyes swept the room, resting briefly on Alice Harrow. She flinched almost imperceptibly under his gaze, the tension in her frame a small yet telling signal. "I have observed a nervousness," he said softly. "Not of fear alone, but of anticipation. The individual who fears being discovered is rarely aware of the markers they leave behind, and yet leave them they do. He rose fully, adjusting his jacket, his voice casual yet edged with authority. We shall now proceed to a controlled test, a simple demonstration of access and timing to ascertain exactly who could have executed such movements undetected. Once performed, the tableau of night will either collapse or confirm the hypothesis. In either case, human error will reveal itself. With that, he moved toward the tower once more, Bunter following, the constable lingering hesitantly. The stage was set, the players arrayed, and the final act, the moment when shadows and intent would collide, was about to unfold under Whimsy's unwavering, calculating eye. Night had settled fully over the village by the time Whimsy returned to the vicarage with Bunter, the church tower now a dark silhouette against the starlit sky. The constable lingered on the doorstep, uncertain whether to enter or remain in the comforting shadow of the familiar. Whimsy, however, moved with quiet assurance, already calculating the sequence of events he intended to test. The household, weary from a day of observation and subtle questioning, awaited intense anticipation. Even the housekeeper, normally impervious, seemed aware that the evening would bring revelations she might not welcome. Whimsy's first act was to summon Alice Harrow. She entered cautiously, hands clasped, eyes downcast. "Miss Harrow," he said softly, "we are to reconstruct the events of last night, minute by minute. Your cooperation is essential, and I assure you, no inference of guilt is implied. Accuracy alone is requested." He paused, letting the weight of his expectation settle. "Your movements, your observations, even your hesitations will illuminate what mere footprints and locked doors cannot." Alice nodded, swallowing hard. Bunter produced a small pad and pencil to record her account, as Whimsy guided her through the chronology, from the delivery of supper to the return to her own quarters. At each step, he inquired about precise positions, small actions, and incidental observations, the alignment of cutlery, the position of hymn books, the way the tray had been carried, and even the angle of the lamp casting shadows on the tower wall. With the account completed, Whimsy led her to the churchyard. "We must now test the feasibility of each movement under the conditions reported: darkness, restricted access, and observation by the sexton. You will perform exactly as you did last night." Alice's knees trembled slightly, but she obeyed, walking the path as she had hours before, with Whimsy noting every hesitation, every shift in weight, the timing of each step. "From the shadows," Whimsy observed, Bunter recording. "Notice," Whimsy murmured, "the momentary pause at the gate, the slight adjustment of the tray in response to uneven gravel. Such details, trivial in appearance, are the fingerprint of human behavior, and these will reveal the plausibility of the orchestrated scene above." They ascended the tower, Whimsy following closely. He asked Alice to demonstrate the placement of objects as she had done in the vestry, the arrangement of the tray, the positioning of hymn books and cushions, and the opening and closing of the tower door. At each motion, he observed subtle traces of deviation from the previous night, gestures unnoticed, hesitations she did not herself recall. When the exercise concluded, Whimsy leaned against the ladder, eyes glittering with the quiet triumph of comprehension. "We now have the means to compare opportunity with action. Observe, Bunter. Each movement, each pause, each seemingly insignificant adjustment creates a pattern. If one overlays the nocturnal movements upon the sequence of events we know, the supper, the rehearsal, the sexton's observation, a narrow corridor of opportunity emerges. Only one person could have executed all actions in the precise sequence without detection." He descended, moving to the vicarage steps with deliberate calm. "Timing, access, and the subtlety of human behavior, the last piece of our puzzle remains the motive. Here, one must combine knowledge of habits with the study of human psychology. Jealousy, ambition, or perhaps a desire to impress, control, or divert attention. Alice's shoulders stiffened. The housekeeper's face was pale. Whimsy's gaze swept the assembled household, lingering briefly on each in turn before settling on the single figure whose subtle reactions had consistently betrayed tension. Slight tremors of hands, imperceptible flickers of eyes, the unconscious shifts that spoke louder than words. Opportunity and access we have mapped. Timing and execution we have tested. And the human element, always the most revealing, has spoken more clearly than any witness. In short, the orchestration was precise and the theatre deliberate. The individual responsible has, through their own involuntary disclosures, marked themselves unmistakably. He paused, letting the weight of the declaration settle. Tomorrow, we shall confront this person with the evidence and with the inescapable chain of deduction. Tonight, I advise caution, for even the cleverest mind trembles when anticipation meets inevitability. The final act is imminent. Bunter, noting the quiet intensity, made a final entry in his pad. Outside, the tower loomed silently, the wind stirring the ropes as if whispering in anticipation of revelation. Whimsy, gloved hands folded behind his back, stared upward, already composing the sequence of exposition that would, with quiet precision, unveil the truth hidden among shadows, schedules, and human frailty. The following morning, the vicarage was quiet in a way that seemed almost ceremonial, as if the house itself anticipated the revelation about to unfold. Whimsy arrived early, Bunter at his side, eyes alert for any subtle disturbance in the domestic order. The household gathered in the parlor under pretense of routine, though their faces betrayed varying degrees of apprehension. Even the housekeeper, usually a pillar of composure, carried a faint tension in her shoulders, while Alice Harrow's hands were clasped so tightly that her knuckles shone white. Whimsy seated himself at the head of the table, his expression calm, almost genial, belying the sharpness in his eyes. "We are here," he began, "to examine the results of our observations, the reconstruction of nocturnal movements, and the study of opportunity and motive. All elements point to a particular sequence of events, executed with remarkable precision, yet betraying subtle, unavoidable human markers." He allowed a brief pause, glancing casually over the assembled faces. The body was arranged meticulously. The bell ropes were manipulated with an understanding of their mechanics. Footprints, though controlled, reveal variations inconsistent with anyone other than a practiced hand. Access was limited, opportunity circumscribed, and yet someone traversed these constraints flawlessly. Observations, both direct and inferred, allow us to reconstruct with exactitude the actions leading to the tragedy. Alice shifted, but remained silent. Whimsy's gaze rested lightly on her, noting the nervous tension, the almost imperceptible flinch at his words. "Now, let us consider the human element. Even the most meticulous planner cannot fully suppress involuntary signals. Hesitation, repetition, adjustment of objects, and subtle errors in timing. These markers are invaluable. They are the footprints of intention, impervious to conscious control." He leaned forward slightly. "Miss Harrow, your movements last night, as rehearsed and now tested, demonstrated precisely the sequence required to execute the orchestrated scene in the tower. Each step, each placement, each minor adjustment of the tray, the hymn books, and the lamp corresponded exactly to the conditions necessary to simulate a nocturnal figure observed by the sexton. The exercise this morning confirmed the feasibility and alignment of opportunity with execution." Alice's hands trembled, though she did not speak. The housekeeper's eyes narrowed and the vicar's expression darkened with dawning understanding. Whimsy continued, his tone calm but edged with inevitability. The individual responsible did not act from mere malice. Motive, subtle and complex, arises from familiarity, knowledge of routine, and the desire to control perception. You, Miss Harrow, possessed all these elements, Your familiarity with the household, the organist's habits, and the sexton's perceptions enabled the orchestration of the evening with precision sufficient to deceive casual observation. He paused, letting the words resonate. Every minor hesitation, every adjustment, every slight deviation from the usual routine has been noted, catalogued, and aligned with the reconstruction of the evening. Human nature, even when attempting artful deception, cannot suppress these involuntary disclosures. And so the truth emerges, not by confession, but by the incontrovertible evidence of action. Alice finally lifted her eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and recognition. Whimsy's voice remained gentle, almost conversational, though it carried the weight of finality. The night was a theater, the stage your familiar territory, the players observed and guided by subtle manipulation. You orchestrated the scene, perhaps not fully contemplating the inevitability of discovery, but leaving behind the traces that, when combined with opportunity and human observation, could not fail to reveal the truth. He reclined slightly, steepling his fingers. The pattern is complete, the chain of deduction unbroken. It remains only for you to acknowledge what is evident to all who have observed, recorded, and reconstructed the movements of last night. The room was silent, except for the ticking of a small clock. Alice's lips trembled, and then she exhaled sharply, the tension breaking in a mixture of resignation and fear. Whimsy's eyes, sharp yet not unkind, watched as the last piece of the puzzle, the human faltering under the weight of inevitability, revealed itself with quiet, undeniable clarity. The village had returned to its usual orderly rhythm, as if the night's grim events were a passing shadow that would not linger long in daylight. The church tower stood silent and unassuming, its bells no longer echoing the secretive drama of the previous evening. Whimsy, dressed with his habitual elegance and accompanied by the ever-efficient Bunter, departed the vicarage under a crisp morning sun that cast sharp, revealing shadows across the gravel paths. Alice Harrow had been taken into custody, her confession measured and subdued, acknowledging the orchestration of the events that had so confounded the village. There was no hysteria, no frantic escape, only a quiet recognition of her own misjudgment, her careful plan undone by the meticulous observation and of a man who delighted in trivialities that most ignored. The vicar, pale yet relieved, accompanied the household in seeing her safely conveyed, a muted acknowledgment of both justice and the fragility of human intention. Whimsy, as always, left the constable to the formalities, preferring to observe the resolution with the detached amusement of a man who understood the theatre of human error better than any tragedy could convey. He strolled along the churchyard, hands behind his back, noting the alignment of gravestones, the slight tilt of the tower windows, and the faint ripple of the morning breeze through the hedges. "Every detail," he murmured to Bunter, "is a story waiting to be read, and tonight we have merely turned the last page of this one." Bunter, accustomed to these reflections, merely nodded, recording his master's musings with disciplined attention. Whimsy's eyes, however, caught the smallest imperfection, a stone slightly displaced, a shadow lingering where it ought not, and he allowed a small, wry smile. Even in resolution, Bunter, life continues to whisper its subtle complexities. One must only listen. Sharp. The time they reached the lane leading away from the vicarage, the village had resumed its gentle bustle. Postmen and milk carts moving in habitual precision, unaware of the quiet drama that had transpired above their heads. Whimsy paused, tipping his hat to the rising sun. "Justice is rarely flamboyant, Bunter," he said, "and yet it is always, when pursued with care, inevitable. Order has been restored, appearances corrected, and yet the human heart, even when guilty, leaves a trace of its artistry behind." He turned, walking toward the distant station, Bunter following in precise step. "And so," Whimsy concluded with a characteristic lilt of irony, We depart this little stage, leaving behind lessons in observation, opportunity, and the subtle miscalculations of those who believe themselves cleverer than the world permits. The bells will toll again, the organist will rest in peace, and life, damp, ordinary, and punctuated by error, will proceed in its quiet, inexorable fashion. And with that, Lord Peter Wimsey and Bunter disappeared down the lane, leaving the village to its routines and the faint echo of a detective's presence, whose curiosity, wit, and unerring logic had untangled the threads of human intention with the precision of a master composer. The case, concluded, would be remembered not for the shock of crime, but for the elegance of its resolution, a quiet triumph of intellect, patience, and the inescapable truths hidden in the small, seemingly insignificant details of everyday life. The shadows of the tower lingered in memory, the whispers of the night now replaced by the clarity of daylight, and the village exhaled a collective sigh of order restored, unaware that the most subtle of dramas had passed, orchestrated by the imperceptible genius of Lord Peter Wimsey.